You're listening to theoutdoorstation.co.uk.
Hello and welcome to another podcast from SeaKayakRoutes.com. I'm Simon Willis and this one is all about the UK Coastguard. I've recorded it, the local one, which is Clyde Coastguard. It's different because many of the questions I've asked were suggested by contributors to the UK Sea Kayak Guidebook Forum, such as how and when to give the Coast Guard what they call a TR, a transit report, basically letting them know where you're starting from and going to, and what would happen if you didn't call in when you were finished. The correct procedure to ask for a weather forecast if you missed it, how to call for help and what happens when you do, and a new communication system that could patch you through to expert medical knowledge in an emergency. Plus, there's some tricky questions there about perhaps a lack of knowledge of our sport among some Coast Guards. It is a longer podcast than normal, but it's a good one.
Yeah, my name's Bill Speirs. I'm what we term a watch manager at Clyde Coastguard in Greenock. As the term suggests, I manage the watch of maybe between 5 and 7 people. We're responsible for maritime search and rescue, civilian maritime search and rescue, that is, for the Clyde district, which stretches from, in the south, the Mull of Galloway, to Ardnamurchan Point in the north, and out to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where we bump into the Canadians and the American search and rescue authorities. So we're civil servants, but we are uniformed civil servants. If you like, the lowest grade is the Coast Guard Watch Assistant. We're all full-time, regular Coast Guards. The next grade up from that is the Watch Officer, and then I suppose the highest grade within the operations room is the Watch Manager. In terms of incident working, it's my job to basically to look at the information as it comes in and decide what units we're going to task for that particular job, whether it be lifeboats, helicopters, Coast Guard rescue teams, or broadcast action you might want to take, and all that type of thing to do with an incident. In terms of routine day-to-day work, I've got to ensure that everything that's required, weather forecasts that are put out on time, and the right contents within that.
Let's just set the scene of where we are, because we're in the Navy buildings in Greenock,
yeah. And
we're on the second floor, and we're in a sort of a separate room at the moment, looking back into the control room through these glass windows. Now there seems to be, how can I put it, 2 rows of desks facing into a square, with 2 people on each row of desks. There's positions for 3 to be on each desk. On one wall, where you've got windows, on the other wall you've got a map and 2 very large charts of this whole area, and in between all that is your desk, and you sit in the middle. Now, on the far side, I know we have the Channel 16 desk, and we'll go on to talk about that in a moment. How does that all work?
And most of our operations rooms are set up like that, because there is a need for eye contact, but certainly the watch manager who's sitting in the middle has got that ability. He can turn and speak to, on this station, left-hand side is the Channel 16 operator, and what we would call the other terminals or workstations are what we term working desks, and that's where the routine traffic would be handled. If you called up for, say, a weather forecast, the Channel 16 operator would answer you initially, then they would pass the calling station over to one of the workstations, and one of the other operators that would deal with that inquiry. Similarly, if a telephone rings in this station, Channel 16 operator doesn't answer telephone calls, because basically he's got enough to handle with the number of aerial sites he's got. So if a telephone call comes in, whether it be 999 or just in one of the routine lines, it'll flash up on one of the other desks, or in fact it'll flash up on all the other desks, and whoever answers it just takes the call. So it just depends who's available at the time, because you can have multiple jobs at any one time, particularly in some of the south coast stations like Solent and Brixham, etc. So you could have maybe one operator dealing with a particular incident in one area, and another operator dealing with another incident somewhere else, and the watch manager's meant to keep an overview of exactly what's going on.
You were saying to me earlier that you risk assess the watches, and that helps your staffing. You've got, as I say, a team of 5, including yourself, in here now. How many do you get up to on a busy day, and how many do you think do other busy stations, like Solent perhaps, get up to?
I mean, I would say maybe 7 on here on a busy day in the summer. I would imagine Solent, certainly Aberdeen, are similarly manned up as far as I'm aware. Some of the smaller stations, possibly talking 3 or 4. I worked over in 4th Coastguard for about a year and a half, and their sort of standard manning level was about 4. Andy, can I just show Simon your 16 screen here, just to explain what's... That's a standard screen that you'd listen to on this station in Channel 16. So you see there's 14 aerial sites from remote aerial sites that are feeding back into that screen. So just by touching the button, they can select to transmit on that one, which is Glengorm up in Mull. Whenever a signal comes in, you'll get an indication on whichever aerial it's coming in on. Unfortunately, because there's an overlap, you can get maybe 3 aerials lighting up, but it gives you a power indication which one's the strongest signal. We've got 3 aerial sites that have got direction finding equipment on them. If you do a transmission, then it shows you, if you just look at that one there, Andy's transmitted on one of our aerial sites, say Roostaffnish. It's down at the bottom end of Kintyre, down past Campbelltown, and it's been picked up. You see on that the aerial in Islay.
Yeah.
That's coherent, it's got a DF, so it's giving you a bearing of where that transmission's coming from. If you imagine yourself on a ship or, say, a kayak, and say you were off Islay, for instance, and you were out here, and you transmitted, we would get a bearing from that coherent aerial site on the runs of Islay. You
get a bearing and cross-reference with another bearing as well?
Well, you can, if depending on the strength of the signal, of course, but say a kayak, for instance, off Islay,
a little handheld one,
it would only be picked up on that one. We wouldn't get it down Kintyre, or that other one's over here in Law Hill, which is the way out. You've got to tell us how far off you are. It's only giving you a bearing, it's not giving you any distance. But having said that, if it's still better, if you say for in search and rescue circumstances, if you were sending a helicopter or a lifeboat, you would send them down that bearing line, and hopefully they would come across the casualty. This is the loudspeaker it comes out of, is it? Because you used to sit with headphones on, didn't you? No, the speaker's behind here, but we still operate with headphones as well. But the speaker's just behind the set there. I mean, we do keep it's a loudspeaker watch as such, but on this station particularly, we tend to use the headphones because we are monitoring so many remote aerial sites. You really need to be watching that screen all the time.
Coastguard.
So that's just one of the local naval vessels, or support vessels for the Navy anyway. So as I say, he came up on Roseneath, which is the aerial site just across there, because he was working in the local area. But yeah, you're right, Andy's sitting here and he's got his headphones on, and you have them on all the time when you're on the Channel 16 watch?
Or if I'm sort of trying to do something else and I don't want to lose sort of focus on what's going on, which you can do quite easily unless you're sort of paying attention to it, especially in a busy weekend. You could have several signals coming up at one time, somebody in the north of the district, somebody in the south. So if you're not paying attention, you don't really know where they've shouted from, which aerials particularly picking it up.
So the headphones gives you that focus?
Well, it concentrates your mind on what's going on when it's busy.
Yeah, particularly if you've got, you can have telephones going at, on other desks, you can have people on, our private channel, Channel 0, you can have lifeboats coming up there on exercise, etc. So there can be an awful lot going on around the ops room, particularly in an incident situation, and if the 16 operator needs to be, as Andy says, have that focus on what's going on that particular desk and what's coming in those aerials.
What's the other screen?
That's what we term Vision, which is our sort of logging command and control system. Well, it's a sort of development of the old paper system where basically we just wrote down everything. But it has a mapping system on it there, but this section here is a radio log. Now every call that comes in that Andy takes or answers, he'll log in there, he'll type in who it's from, who it's to, invariably ourselves, and the details of the call. So if someone calls up on Channel 16, that will be logged in that system.
This is Clyde, Coastguard, you're live in Clyde, over.
Let's just talk about some practical stuff. Nick Crowhurst in Cornwall asked this. What's your attitude to receiving a radio check request on Channel 16 at the start of a trip? Do you ever get overloaded with such calls? I think he's thinking particularly of the busy areas, like he says it must be a nightmare for them in Solent on a summer weekend.
What they recommend in terms of radio communications is always listen to the channel you're going to transmit on before you actually transmit. Now, I would suggest if you're down in the Solent area and there's what the term white noise, it's just wall-to-wall people on the radio, it's maybe not the most appropriate time to try and do a radio check with Solent Coastguard, and maybe look at other ways of trying to check if your radio is okay. If you feel there is a problem and you really need to do the radio check, then I don't think we would say don't do it.
When I put out a request on the UK forum about any questions any other sea kayakers would like me to ask on their behalf, most questions centred around this single point. When should we try to log a trip report with you guys? When should we say this is when we're starting off? Also, what would happen if we didn't respond back? What would happen if you tried to call us during the course of a passage and the radio was off? Because that often happens on a multi-day thing to save batteries. Basically, when should we do it? Now, I know it's going to come back to the sea kayaker, well, you should do it when you think you need to do it. Is that the only answer, really?
Well, you're right when they need to do it, if they feel, I say uncomfortable, that's maybe the wrong word, but, if they feel there is a need to pass a TR. Sometimes, now, in the West Coast...
TR being trip report?
Yes, or transit report, yeah. Up here we encourage that, the geographical area we're dealing with, the changes in the way that you get here so dramatically. We find one or two, telephone them in, maybe just before they're setting off. That doesn't clog up the radio system so much.
But you actively encourage that. That's a thing that you would...
We certainly do up here. I mean, again, I'm always wary about saying, well, yes, go and do it, and that's a blanket coverage across the UK, when, down in Solent, I appreciate that in places like that, in Brexham and the South Coast, there's just, there's radio traffic all the time.
It also probably helps, even if you do have the experience, but say you knew you were going to be practicing rescues or something, it would probably be a good idea to somehow let you guys know. So in case somebody else phones in that we've seen kayakers in the water, if you already know that, would that help?
Oh, yes, certainly. I mean, if you're doing that type of activity, it's going to be, because it's amazing the number of people that are looking out from ashore and see things and think it's something's amiss, when it's been, quite a routine sort of drills that have been carried out.
What information do you need, and does this fit with the CG66 scheme? I've got actually a copy of the bit of paper here that I just downloaded off the internet for the CG66, if it does.
In terms of the transit report, what we're looking for is where you've left from, where you're going to, your ETA at that destination, and the number of people in the party. That's the basic stuff we need to know. Basically, what we're saying is, say you're leaving, I don't know, say 8 o'clock in the morning, you're doing a trip that's going to finish at 12, and we get a call from a shore contact at 3 in the afternoon saying you haven't arrived, then we know where to start the search from, and we know what sort of direction you've been heading in.
So when Mark in Dorset asked a question, he said, is there any consistent and simple way we can record a trip activity with you so you have the information to hand? Well, that's it.
That's it, yeah. That's
every Coast Guard would work like that?
Yes, yeah.
So that's where you're going from, where you're going to, what time you expect to arrive, and how many in the party?
That's right, yeah. That's it.
What happens if you didn't arrive at that time?
Nothing will happen. That's one thing I must stress, that we will not do anything. If you don't call us back and say we've arrived at such and such a place, safe and well, we won't do anything. If your wife phones up 3 hours later and said, Simon hasn't phoned me up to tell me that he's arrived at such and such a place, then we will take action. But we won't take action because we'd be taking action all the time, to be honest with you. And invariably it's just someone that's forgotten to phone us and they're up at the pub.
Or it could also be that you managed to get a VHF signal or mobile phone signal at the start of your trip, and you didn't get one when you got to the end, so you physically couldn't call in, presumably. Yeah. So that's, I mean, obviously you would ring in or call in and say, right, we got here if you could,
yes.
But it isn't the end of the world if you don't.
No, that's right. And we certainly won't have helicopters flying around looking for you if you've not been able to do that.
Chris in Basingstoke asked, do you prefer we file a trip plan with a home contact rather than with the Coast Guard for minor trips?
If the shore contact knows the information that, if they're not hearing from you when you get to that position, they know to get in touch with the Coast Guard straight away. I don't think there's any problem with that, doing that, as long as they have all the information. And that's where you talked about the CG66. Sometimes these shore contacts say it's a wife or a relation that phones up and say, so-and-so hasn't arrived, and then we'll start asking them about descriptions and, what if they've got a radio, if they've got a mobile phone, what you're wearing, all these sort of things, where flares carried, description of kayaks, etc. And they might, not have all that information to hand, and that's where the CG66 comes into its own.
Now, CG66, as I know it, is just this bit of paper that you download from the internet, you fill it in, you send it in to your local Coast Guard. Right. Now, what do you do with it at this end?
Every Coast Guard station has what we would call a CG66 coordinator. And the role of that individual is they get all those forums that come in and they input it into a national database. the system can be interrogated from Yarmouth or Falmouth or anywhere around the UK or Shetland. So you could be working anywhere or kayaking out of any location, and they could still get that information.
And basically runs through the details of the vessel, the type of the craft, life-saving equipment, radio navigation equipment, the normal activity that's on there, and fill that in, and it means somebody doesn't have to answer those questions over the phone or over the radio.
Yeah. I mean, it's in terms of the overdue situation where maybe someone comes in, you haven't, arrived when you're meant to arrive, you haven't phoned back home to say that, then initially we would start putting out broadcast action. Say it's only a couple of hours overdue and there's maybe been a change in the weather, we would start putting out broadcast action with a description of the craft. And with that type of information, it's so much easier to do that.
Here's a tricky one, okay? This is from Chris in Warrington, and he says, it pulls together all the things we've just been discussing, actually. It would be interesting to hear what they expect from paddlers on a multi-day trip regarding listening on VHF. His point is that handheld battery life is such that most kayakers switch them off. Perhaps even after they're called in, I do it myself. Or they switch it on just for the weather forecast. He's got experience of checking in at the start of a multi-day trip, switching off his radio, but then a yacht called into the Coastguard to say he thought he saw some kayaks that were in difficulty. They weren't, but the Coastguard couldn't raise the kayaks because of the VHF. The natural assumption there is, they are in difficulty. And the shore contact was phoned. Everyone got very worried. It was only now, I don't think any sort of helicopters were launched or lifeboats were launched. It doesn't say that. But there wasn't a bit of worry with the shore contact being involved. And everything got sorted out as soon as the radio got switched on. Is that just one of the things that I suppose has to happen in a way if those events conspire to create that situation, and it's better to be safe than sorry? Or can you think of a way around that, Bill? See what I mean? I did say it was a tricky one.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that's just something you have to live with. Kayakers, and particularly up in this neck of the woods, are particularly good at, you get some that phone in and give you a programme of a multi-day voyage, and they say, we're going to be switched off, but once we get to our first stop or the off point, we'll give you a call. And similarly, but yes, you've got that risk of if someone comes up and says, we've seen some kayakers in difficulty, and it's that party is transiting through that area, but you've got no way of contacting them. Because
the onus actually comes onto you a bit then, doesn't it? Because if you didn't have a shore contact, you'd be like, right, well, what do I do? I can't raise them on the VHF. Do I assume the worst, or do I take action? What would you do in that situation, Bill?
I think in that situation, we're talking about what we would term an uncertainty phase. We're uncertain whether there's a problem there or not. It's the type of situation where I would likely send out a Coastguard rescue team, or a couple of members from a Coastguard rescue team, the local team, to go and maybe interview the first informant who had sighted this.
But if they're on a yacht sailing up there somewhere, you can't. Well, you maybe get onto a yacht on the VHF, couldn't you?
Yeah, or if they're close to shore, which they may well be, then we would look for them from the shore side. It may well be we put out a broadcast, and any other vessels in the area, could assist us in that to try and sort of nail it down and put it to bed before it it does get out of hand. Or I say get out of hand, but before we start, and these things can take on a bit of a life of their own. There's no doubt about it, because you're not getting to the bottom of it, and there's always this thing in the back of your mind, well, maybe there is, something's really gone wrong. I mean, what do we need to be doing about it? It's a difficult one to call, and I suppose that's why I sit in that seat, and I've got to sort of make that decision, and I've got to decide there comes a point when maybe we haven't managed to make contact, nothing's come out of the woodwork to suggest otherwise, so we've got to say, well, we're going to have to get a lifeboat out here to just make sure these people are all right.
And the inshore forecast issued by the Met Office at 1200, Sunday the 22nd of April. The inshore waters forecast is 12 miles offshore from 1200.
Why did the weather forecast times change?
We took a lot of information or opinion back from the customer, and it was felt that there was a need maybe to enhance the service we were giving to them. So the forecasts, although there's a repeat forecast now, it's basically every 3 hours. Every Coast Guard station's putting it out. The fact that the equipment we've got in now is a recorded system, whereby you can record the forecast and just close to 3 hours. Assuming there's no update as such, then you would just put out the recording again. It's not as if someone's having to sit there and physically read out the forecast. We do that once, it's on the recording, until it gets updated.
Now the Caledonian inshore forecast, covering the area Mull of Kintyre to Ardnamurchan Point.
If I want to get an updated weather forecast, what actually is the procedure? What do I do?
Well, you would call us on Channel 16, assuming you've missed the broadcast.
Yeah.
You'd call us on Channel 16.
Okay, Clyde Coastguard, Clyde Coastguard. This is Quest. What do I then say?
You should really immediately tell us what you're looking for.
Right.
Rather than, as the onus is on the calling station
Right.
to identify this, Clyde Coastguard, this is Quest, over.
Right.
Really is, again, it's all about using up radio time.
Yeah.
So we have to come back to you and say, Quest,
want?
this is Clyde Coastguard, what do you want, basically?
Right. So the procedure should be, Clyde Coastguard, this is Quest, request weather forecast.
Or local forecast.
Yeah.
And then our operator, as we saw on the Channel 16, he would likely have a good idea of what aerial you came up on.
Yep.
So he would come back on that aerial and say, Quest, this is Clyde Coastguard, channel 84, or whatever the working
And stand by, probably.
Sometimes you'll hear people saying, await our call, or wait our call.
And he would specify the channel. Coastguard would specify the channel.
That's right. Then you would go up to channel 84 and then await our call, and we would Quest, this is Clyde Coastguard. Obviously make that initial contact to make sure you were on 84. It would say, Quest, this is Clyde Coastguard, over. And you would come up and say, Clyde Coastguard, this is Quest, requesting the weather forecast for, the Clyde area, or the Caledonia area, whatever it might be. And then the operator would come back to you and say, he'll have brought the forecast up on the screen, on the vision screen, and he'll say, Quest, this is Clyde Coastguard, and then he would read out the forecast.
Right. And at the end of it, I just go, Coastguard, Quest, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah,
out.
And when you say that word out, that whoever says it, that's the termination of the communication.
How would that differ from an emergency call on Channel 16?
The correct answer is that if you're in grave and imminent danger, it should be Mayday. So it's Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Quest. And you would follow the procedure, your position, the nature of the distress, how many people you've got on board, and any other relevant information.
That's all in the first transmission.
In that first transmission, yeah. As much, and then the operator would come back and say, and they would prefix, every transmission should be prefixed with the word Mayday. So our operator would come back and say, Mayday, Quest, this is Clyde Coastguard, and if he's happy with what he's received, or that initial basic information, he will say, receive Mayday, and he's giving you receipt of your Mayday call, and then he might go on to ask you a bit more, or maybe the weather on scene, descriptions and things like that.
If it was a medical emergency that you needed help with, but you're assuming it isn't a medical emergency, let's say a fairly serious incident, are we grave and imminent danger here, though, are we?
No, you're into the urgency, which is the pan type transmission, and
that's the pan being one down from.
Yes, yeah, the urgency as opposed to distress, and again, it's not grave and imminent, but it's still serious enough. The response to that is, I'm not saying it's going to be exactly the same, but if you've got someone there who's maybe had a head injury or whatever, the SAR mission coordinator, me in this case, would make the decision, well, this sounds like a really serious case, let's get a helicopter going. Having said that, we now have the facility to patch you through to medical authorities by VHF radio through that system we've got there. So we can actually put you in touch with a doctor at an A&E department, in our case up in Aberdeen. They could, if you weren't an injured party, if you were, say, the companion, he could speak to you direct through the radio. And he could interrogate you then and say, well, and then he's, if you like, not making the decision for us, but on the basis of what he's saying, oh, well, it's, I think you need to get this individual, up to the Southern General Hospital in Glasgow because he's had a serious, head injury or whatever. Or it might well be, they might say, well, no, just hold on, it's not that grave, but we'll do something else.
But you're saying the person who's on the scene could talk to that doctor, so that could be very useful, far more than first aid. Does that only apply if you call in on VHF, as opposed to if you rang in on mobile phone?
No, we can patch through. I'm right in saying we can patch through in any of those circumstances.
How new is that facility?
That's quite a new facility. That's ICCS system, which you're going to ask me what it stands for, I just can't remember. But I think it's Integrated Communication and Control System, or Integrated Coastguard Control System, something like that. But it's
Blooming useful. Have you used it yet? No.
Oh yes, yeah, use it quite a lot. Use it quite a lot with fishing vessels offshore that maybe have an injured crewman on board. I hate to go back to this financial side of things, but it is a lot of resources involved. I mean, in terms of maybe taking a crewman off a fishing vessel out off Rockall, you're talking about sending a helicopter out there. You'll likely have a Nimrod fixed-wing aircraft to give them top cover, and it's a long way offshore, and it can be quite risky in terms of the weather conditions. So you've got to be 100% sure that is it best for the patient, if you like, that we commit this resource to try and get them off, or is it better that they just wait where they are and get them a bit closer, or the vessel comes right alongside? So these are the decisions that the medical people make, not really ourselves, that are far more qualified to make.
Do you have a view on people who are untrained or haven't got the bit of paper on the calling you up on the VHF?
The official view would be that they should be properly trained, because that training, as you know yourself, takes into account all the Mayday, the PAN, all those types of broadcast action we would expect, and it gives them an insight into what we're looking for. At the end of the day, if they don't have a piece of paper and they call up and shout help, we're in trouble, they'll get the same response at the end of the day. But our still answer must be that we would encourage everyone to get fully qualified.
Flares, EPIRBs, the other ways of doing it. What happens when somebody shoots off a flare, big parachute flare maybe, or drops an EPIRB in the sea? Now, probably two different answers, each of them quite long, so let's do flares first.
There's always someone sees a flare. The number of calls we get from people that see meteorites and think they're flares and things like that.
But when people have a VHF with them, why carry a flare as well?
You've got to have as many sort of backups as you can. It might well be that someone doesn't hear you, there's a lot of interference, this, that, the other. It could be, another station on top of you just when you make that broadcast, which happens all the time. You really should carry flares.
EPIRBs, any use inshore, do you think?
Oh, yes, I mean, without a doubt.
There's two sorts, or there were two sorts. One was being phased out, wasn't it?
That's right, the 121 was getting phased out. Now, I think I'm right in saying it was somewhat, the accuracy of that was about 11 miles. The 406, which is the one that on just now, it's down to, am I right in saying about 2 miles or something like that. So they're really quite accurate. And, in terms of a helicopter, you can vector right in on that signal. And
what happens if one of those goes in the water, or you trigger one deliberately? What actually is the process? Do you know?
It starts transmitting, and it's picked up by a satellite, and that satellite downloads that information and ends up at Falmouth Coastguard, who are the single point of contact for all those sort of hits, as we call them. They plot the position basically and see which Coastguard district it falls within, and they farm it out to ourselves. As far as we're concerned, that's a distress. If there's a maritime, or if it looks as if it could be on the water, then we will take action on that.
And if it does take time, I mean, if you're in the water for 30 minutes and what have you, and then you've got to task the rescued before you know it's going to come, you could be in the water for a good hour before anything happens.
Well, yeah, there could be, of course, you could be an hour in the water, just because of other circumstances. I think it's worth pointing out that, up in the west coast here, particularly when you get up outside the Clyde, the availability of lifeboats, I wouldn't say few and far between, but they're well spaced out, and that you could, it's, and even to get a helicopter to you from, say, Prestwick, even in daylight, they might be airborne within about 10-15 minutes. You're still talking about maybe half an hour transit time, or even more, to the sort of the north of our area here, up towards Mull and places like that.
Clyde Coastguard, this is Kintyre Express in Channel 16, over.
Kintyre Express, Clyde Coastguard at 67 and standby, please.
Roger, standing by in 67.
Does the adrenaline get going?
Oh yes, certainly. Yes, without a doubt. When that 999 call comes in, or someone's on Channel 16 shouting Mayday, and of course a lot of the times they're in a state, and you have to try and extract the information that you need from someone who's, panicky or they're in a stressful situation. There's no doubt about it. It does, yeah. If it's to search a particular area that we're looking for, say, a casualty in, whether it be a person in the water or whatever, then we would calculate that search area and direct them in the way we would expect that area to be searched.
So you'd work out the drift based on the wind and everything?
Yeah, we have a computer system there called Speirs, which does that for us. It used to be a long-winded hydraulic type where we would extract the tide and the wind information and put it on. Almost like vector addition, if you think about it. That's basically what it was, but you had to get all that information. But now it's all done computerised, so we can come up quite quickly with search areas that we would expect a drifting casualty to appear in, because I'm sure all your people that are aware that although the incident might happen in position A, by the time we get units out an hour later, for instance, and there's been a bit of a drift there in terms of wind and current, so that's the casualty's never going to be in that what we would term the drift start position. It's a good bit further away, and of course there are errors get put into that as well, and it's they just don't necessarily drift downwind and down tide. There's a diversion, so the area can all of a sudden start to get a bit bigger that you're trying to search. Then you need more units for that, of course. And that might be 2 or 3 lifeboats and a helicopter and other vessels that might be in the area.
Bill, what experience do you have to learn how to do all that? You can't just come in here raw and suddenly pick all that up, can you? I mean, do people do that? No,
not into the watch manager's job. I mean, it's
or even as you're saying, your assistants.
Yeah, a Coastguard watch assistant. They certainly we can recruit, if you like, off the street, but they go through a year's training, and within that time there's a task book that they have to go through a whole lot of different areas, and they have to demonstrate, well, to me or to the members of the watch who would sign off those tasks within the task book, that they're competent and basically know what they're talking about. And that's from everything from basic chart work to going out, local knowledge, familiarisation, which is a big issue as well, and how to operate the equipment, etc. We try and recruit people who have a bit of maritime background. I'm lucky at the moment that the Coastguard, the most recent Coastguard watch assistant I've got with me is an ex-second mate from a tanker company, and has worked in the North Sea. He has a lot of maritime experience, big ship maritime experience. Having said that, he's maybe not that familiar with kayaking or yachting.
Do you have any Sea Kayak, is it?
Yes, well, we have 1 or 2, yes, and there's certainly, I know of one over in Forth, and there's certainly a girl up in Aberdeen.
Because actually one of the questions that came in from Mark in Dorset was actually how we can help, as Sea Kayak, help the Coast Guard understand more about this sport, because he's had a couple of instances where he thought the Coast Guard didn't fully appreciate what went on from a kayaker's point of view. I'll give you a quote here. He said he was actually speaking to Clyde last February. He said he spoke to numerous different people in the course of several days, and each case encountered wildly different levels of understanding and interest, had to reiterate his trip details in each time. Now, he's stressing it's not a problem with the Coast Guard, but he's actually saying, how can kayakers give you guys a better understanding of, I suppose, the limitations of the craft, what they can do, what they can't do?
Well, I think that, it's like all these things, I think, sort of communication between the two groups, if you like. And I think, it's, as I spoke briefly there about local knowledge. Now, local knowledge is not just about geographical local knowledge. It's about, the local knowledge of the craft that operate within your area, the limitations and, what you would expect from them, or the dangers that they can get into and the risks involved in that activity. It's, I know we spoke about earlier about maybe clubs coming to visit us. It's a two-way thing when you get a visit from a club. The staff that are on watch are speaking to the individual kayakers, yachtsmen, whoever it might be, windsurfers or divers, and you get information from them about, their sport and their activity. Similarly, if Coastguards go out to do presentations to, say, a kayak club, for instance, there's usually invariably a question and answer sort of session afterwards, and that Coastguard officer comes back with a far better appreciation of what is actually the kayaker or the yachtsman or whatever, what their business is about. I think in answer to the question, and without looking at it specifically, I quite understand you could well be speaking to someone who has no experience of kayaking at all, subsequently may well appear to be, somewhat less than knowledgeable in that subject, and
but might know a lot about tankers.
Well, exactly. Part of the risk assessment we look at is the sort of spread of competencies. It's not necessarily that you'll have someone on a watch that you tend to phone up that's maybe had any experience of kayaking at all. As you say, they may have a tanker experience or yachting experience, etc.
Tom in Aberdeenshire is saying he'd be interested to hear your take on the growth of sea kayaking. It's becoming a much more popular sport and what it means to the Coast Guard, again, coming at how we can help each other, but he noticed that you'd added a section on the website about jet skis. And I just wondered whether the popularity of that sport, you probably had to find out more about jet skis yourself if you're not a jet skier, I don't know.
Yeah, no.
And I just wondered at what stage you think, actually there's an awful lot more people out there going to do this sport. Maybe it becomes sea kayaking at a certain point, I don't know. Mm-hmm. Perhaps we need to know a little bit more about this.
Personal watercraft and jet skis is an interesting one because I've been quite heavily involved in that in the Clyde area. And because
you've had all sorts of problems with them trying to follow the wakes of the boats across the big Calmacs.
Yes, that's what really brought it to a head, was that we have what the term district maritime safety committees, and certainly in Scotland anyway, and there's a similar set up down south. Came up at one of those meetings that there was this issue with personal watercraft, following vessels, etc. And from that, there was a working group set up, which I chair, to basically raise awareness. A lot of it, in terms of the personal watercraft, I've got to say, is likely just lack of education. They likely weren't aware that what they were doing was causing some concern.
That started in a way with a problem to solve.
A problem. Now,
you haven't noticed a problem yet with Sea Kayak?
No. That's not to say that there shouldn't be, some advice, if you like, and best practice in terms of when they should get in contact with us.
Jim in Glasgow was wondering if you ever involved kayaks in search and rescue, because he actually saw this happen once in Stornoway, where there was a call came in from somewhere, and you probably did in all boats in the area, or you tried to get in touch with people, and some kayakers got involved in the SAR.
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, when we put out a broadcast, we'll accept help from anyone that's available to do it, and sometimes things can be resolved very quickly just by a pair of eyes coming back to you and saying, "Oh yeah, I can see such and such," and they're fine, and we can scale things down before they get into a major search.
A question that came from Tony, who's a highly experienced kayaker in Connell. He runs a business there, seafreedomkayak.co.uk. He's actually a friend of mine. He was concerned that he wondered whether the very good safety record that sea kayaking has had, might be compromised by the cheapness of kayaks now and the availability of them with eBay and what have you. More people taking it up and perhaps going into it in a more relaxed frame of mind without so much training, might not dress for the swim, as so many people say you've got to do that. I just wondered, have you any evidence of this happening, that the nature of the people that you're having to deal with or pull out the sea, whether there's a change in mindset about sea kayaking?
I can't say I've noticed that, and sadly we've just had a tragedy up to the north, up Oban Way. I wasn't involved in that, so I couldn't comment on that one, but I haven't personally noted it. But I think you're quite right. I mean, and it's the same with a lot of craft that you can go onto eBay or some of those free newspapers, and you can for a very a modest outlay can purchase yourself, whether it be a kayak or even a powerboat or a speedboat, and just go along, hitch it up and take it away. In fact, in terms of qualification, there's no requirement for anyone to have done courses. You're relying on people thinking to themselves, well, it might be wise if I found out about this before I actually take up the activity. But as far as sea kayaks go, I couldn't say that we've noticed any. There's obviously more of them about, but
you've noticed that much, though?
Oh yes, certainly noticed that. There's no doubt about that, and we get more calls from them. I think they are. Of course, we're not seeing what's going on. We can only it's when they call in, but they certainly seem to be conscientious in that regard. And it's maybe because they have an awareness of they are in quite a comparatively small craft, and in waters that can be quite hostile. At the best of times.
How would people arrange a visit to their local Coast Guard if they're a member of a club, a kayak club or what have you, or even just as individuals? How easy is it to do that, do you know?
Well, it should be, very easy to do it. It's just a question of either telephoning or writing in to the local Coast Guard station. They'll likely programme it, I would say. It's particularly if there's a group just rolling up to the door. This can sometimes present problems, but if it's programmed in advance, then there shouldn't. We would encourage that and welcome that, because communication and liaison between any maritime group, whether it be kayakers or jet skiers or whatever, is always going to be beneficial, not only to the party who come in to visit, but, as I said before, to the staff on station who maybe get a wee insight into that activity that they didn't have before.
That was Bill Speirs and the staff at Clyde Coastguard. My grateful thanks to them. There are many more podcasts in the podcast library at seakayakroutes.com. I'm Simon Willis. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.
That ends the broadcast. This is Clyde Coastguard Island.
Find out how easy it is to subscribe to all our free programmes. Visit our website at theoutdoorstation.co.uk.